Hey, what's up, Push Kids? We're here for our next lecture in AP US history. Today, what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at the regions in the British colonies. And this is going to take two different parts here, so we can kind of keep each one a little bit shorter. Now, last time what we looked at was we looked at the different major colonizers, so the French, the Dutch, and the British, and compared those to the Spanish. Today, what we're going to look at is we're going to start to take an in-depth look at the British colonial regions. And one of the points that I made yesterday was that the British colonies were very different from one another. The different regions were all very different. So in the south versus the middle versus the north. And so we're going to start to explore what makes those regions different from one another. So that brings us to our central question: explain how and why environmental and other factors shape the development and expansion of various British colonies that developed and expanded from 1607 to 1754. And the first key idea is dealing with the Chesapeake and North Carolina, as those colonies grew prosperous and exporting tobacco, a labor-intensive product initially cultivated by white, mostly male indentured servants, and later by enslaved Africans. So we want to understand how this region is going to develop. Now, it all starts off in 1607, and it starts with the colony at Jamestown. Now, Jamestown is the first permanent British colony in North America. It's settled along the Chesapeake Bay in present-day Virginia. Now, it was settled by a bunch of entrepreneurs and a joint stock company called the Virginia Company. And we talked about joint stock companies and how important they were and how expensive these entire trips were. The Dutch and New Amsterdam had also been settled by a joint stock company as well. Now, the company gets started really in 1606, and they get a charter from the king. They recruit settlers. They get 3 ships together, and they go in search of gold. Their whole idea was they wanted to be exactly like the Spanish had been. They want to come to the New World. They figure, well, the Spanish found gold, so we should be able to find gold as well. That was the entire point of their journey. And so they get there, they sail up the Chesapeake, they sail up the James River. They want to try and stay hidden from the Spanish who were down in St. Augustine. They didn't want the Spanish to attack them. They were kind of getting into Spanish territory. They built a fort, a triangular fort like you see in the image right there. But they really struggled their first few years to survive. They don't do so well early on. They come looking for gold, so they don't prepare for much else, and they don't plan to really stay very long. They didn't plant crops, and early on they faced starvation. In fact, in 1609, during the winter of 1609, they face a time period that's called the starving time. It gets so bad that they resort to eating shoe leather, rats, digging up dead bodies. I mean, it was pretty gruesome what they ended up facing. But eventually, this guy right here, a guy named John Smith, he's going to take control. I know he doesn't look anything like the Disney movie, right? And he has a rule: he who will not work will not eat. And he forces people to start to farm and to start to protect themselves. Now, things were very much against these Jamestown settlers. Jamestown was on a swamp. We see a lot of disease among the colonists very much early on. And so much like what we're going to see up north is that early on, because of all this, they're reliant on and somewhat at the mercy of the local Native Americans. The Powhatan Indians, who were a very powerful tribe, there was somewhere around 15,000 of them, were in the region. We can see on the map on the right-hand side all of their different settlements that were around, and they were led by Chief Powhatan, who you see an image on the right-hand side. Now, eventually, though, they are attacked, and in 1622, the Powhatan Uprising is going to kill 340 Jamestown colonists, and it lasts for many, many years. However, despite these kind of early troubles, eventually, in 1612, a guy named John Rolfe is going to introduce tobacco. And this is after Jamestown is the residents fail to find gold. And the joint stock investors demand that they figure out some other way to make money. Now, tobacco, though, becomes very, very popular. Tobacco had already been introduced by the Spanish. It was actually the export of tobacco seeds by the Spanish was actually punishable by death. John Rolfe's able to smuggle out a small vial of tobacco seeds that he sews up in his pants to get it out of there. And it takes to the soil of Virginia very, very well. And it becomes very popular in Europe. It becomes very popular in England. And what this does is it transforms Jamestown into a profitable place. They call it so profitable, they call it brown gold. You can see in the image there the tobacco, which has been dried and put into these large drums, being put onto these tobacco ships on the James River. Now, it was so profitable that what we start to see is it starts to attract more and more people to be able to grow this profitable tobacco. And so Jamestown then starts to expand. And it goes from the settlement at Jamestown to the Virginia colony. And we can see these settlement patterns start to expand. You look at the map there, you see by 1650 where English settlement patterns were, and then by 1700 just how much this has expanded. Now, early on, tobacco was very high in need of workers to be able to not only manage the crop but to plant it and then to pick the crop. Now, typically when we think about people that are working on tobacco plantations, I think many of us oftentimes think of African slaves. But early on, this was not really the case. Early on, landowners in Virginia used people that were called indentured servants to be able to do this work on tobacco plantations. Now, indentured servants were from England, and they looked very much like the person that you see there on the left-hand side. They were usually poor men or poor women. They would sign some sort of contract, and what they would agree to do is to work for a landowner for 4 to 7 years, typically more towards the 7, in exchange for their travel to America. Now remember, traveling to America was incredibly expensive, and so most of these poor people who have no other economic opportunity back in England, they can't get over to the New World on their own, but this allows them to get to the New World, and there's opportunity here. So basically, if they can survive these 7 years, then they become free, they can get their own plot of land, and they have a chance to make an economic life for themselves, a chance that they didn't have back in England. But it was still tough to get these people over. And so in 1618, Virginia is going to introduce what's called the headright system, and this is going to incentivize the bringing over of these indentured servants. So anybody that paid the passage for somebody to come to the New World would get 50 acres of land. And so what this does is this encourages plantation owners to purchase these passages because it extends their own land holdings and brings more and more people to the New World. And so what we see is we see thousands of people from Britain are going to start to migrate as indentured servants by 1700. We see from England there's almost 189,000 people that are going to come over. Now, indentured servants, they worked hard, but they're treated very, very badly. Many die before their contracts end due to the bad working conditions, the poor treatment, or diseases, or even Indian attacks that they face. Now, in addition to indentured servants, we also do start to see the introduction of African slaves. The first African slaves are brought to the New World on a Dutch trading ship in 1619. There are not many, though, not on this ship, and there's not many for a while. By the mid-1600s, there's fewer indentured servants are going to start to come to America. This is because passage becomes cheaper. There's also just less people that are willing to go over at this time. And so what starts to happen is there starts to be a transition from indentured servants to African slaves as the dominant labor system in Virginia. Now, African slaves are going to be transferred to America in a process that's called the Middle Passage. African slaves were usually captured by other African nations and then sold to slave traders, usually from England or from the Dutch, to be transported across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, absolutely horrendous conditions. We can see the way that they're packed onto ships is oftentimes called tight packing. And you can see this in the next couple images here, the coffin position that's oftentimes used below deck. You can see how people are stacked to try and maximize space. And if there's ever any trouble, they'd just be thrown overboard. And when they got to the New World, they would be sold into slavery. The next region that we want to take a look at is we want to take a look at the New England region. And what we want to be able to really do is be able to compare and contrast this to the Chesapeake region. So our second key idea is the New England colonies, initially settled by Puritans, developed around small towns with family farms and achieved a thriving mixed economy of agriculture and commerce. So unlike the colonists from Jamestown, the colonists who first settled in New England came for religious reasons. Now, religious disagreement in Britain had led to divisions in the Anglican Church. And so we had a lot of different religious groups that are there. Now, the Puritans, as one of these different groups, believed in what's called this Calvinist idea of predestination and living strictly as Christians without sin. And really, they weren't too fond of the Anglican Church. They thought that it had compromised much too much with the Catholics in Catholic rituals. And many of them were separatists, and they really didn't want to reform the church. They just wanted to leave. And so these separatists became the Pilgrims. And so they formed their own joint stock company. They pooled their resources together to fund their expedition to the New World, much like the Dutch had done, much like the Virginia Company had done. They get a charter to leave, and they create the Plymouth Colony in America. Now, before they land, they do sign an important early governmental document that's pretty important called the Mayflower Compact. They work together, they decide to work together what's called a civil body politic. And it's really the first example of self-government in America. Now, similar to what's happening down in Jamestown, when they arrived in 1620, they're also facing disease and they're also facing hunger as well. Now, they do, like the early Virginians, get some initial help from Native Americans, from local leaders like Squanto and Massasoit. They celebrate the first Thanksgiving, as you see in the picture there. But soon, the relationship with Native Americans will sour, especially over conflicts over land. Now, after the separatist Pilgrims come to America, the Puritans remained within the Church of England. But things change. King Charles I comes to power, and the Puritans felt there was time to leave England. And so in 1630, Puritans are going to arrive in Boston and create the New England colony of Massachusetts. They're going to be led by a guy named John Winthrop, and he's going to lead 16,000 Puritans to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in what's called the Great Migration. And his whole concept is to create what's called a city upon a hill. Basically, he wants Boston and Massachusetts to be a model to other Christians about how society should be based. Now, Massachusetts, it's a much different colony from Virginia. Puritans are going to come there for religious freedom. Unlike the mostly male population of Virginia, Puritans are going to come mostly as families. And generally, they sacrifice for the common good. We see them building schools or focusing on subsistence farming. And generally, it's a healthier place to live than in Virginia. The colonists live longer, and we can see that from the chart there on the right-hand side. And they're living nearly to 70 years old. But they soon have conflict with Native Americans over land. The Pequot War in 1637 leads to the death of over 600 Indians. And then later on, King Philip's War, which breaks out in 1675, and it leads to 10% of all colonial men being killed, and Native Americans losing again, which they'll usually do. Well, that brings us to the end of our lecture for today. A few key things that we really want to point out is the similarities and differences between the Chesapeake region and between the New England region. They're both formed by joint stock companies, though the people come for different reasons. They both have early positive but later negative interactions with Native Americans. Next time we're going to be looking at the middle colonies in the Deep South. Until then, go Wolfpack.